What it is, what it was, what it shall be. We're back again. Today's video, Spirit War Boot Camp number 93. This one's entitled Agape, Thelema, and Non-Human Intelligence. So how's everyone doing? It's kind of baffling to me how so much of what we've been discussing in these videos is going to collide with current events, right? That's just been happening over the past few days, and how all these things are connected. And what if I told you that the concept of the spirit war, the Illuminati, Aleister Crowley, Robert Anton Wilson, the Rothschild family, Jeffrey Epstein, non-human intelligences, and the major religions of the world were all closely connected. Okay, so let's start in 1947, which I feel is quite a pivotal year. First of all, the modern state of Israel had just come into existence at that time. The United States Air Force had just been created at that time. The Roswell incident is very recent at that time. The death of Aleister Crowley, also there. Uh, Creation of the CIA, the creation of the National Security Agency and the National Security Act. All of these things happened at the same time. What is going on with that? And how do all these things connect? Of course, another closely related course of events has to deal with Jack Parsons, the creation of, what we're now calling NASA, the United States rocketry program, and Israel obtaining nuclear materials, nuclear weapons program, nuclear energy. All these things are very closely connected and all happened within a tiny window of time, which to me is quite suspect. So for those that don't know, okay, there's this thing called the Babylon working, which was going on involving Jack Parsons, creator of the JPL, creator of the modern rocketry program, and all the rockets, solid fuel rockets that were used to launch the space shuttle and various other types of rocketry, right, was involved. Jack Parsons was involved with L. Ron Hubbard, the founder of Scientology, and both of them considered themselves to be disciples and students of Aleister Crowley, famous occultist, creator of, or not creator of, but head of the OTO, who was both of these scientific our military intelligence officers, right? He was their mentor, doing weird spirit evocations and trying to incarnate the spirit of Babylon into a homunculus. Guess who else was a close student of Crowley? Mr. Jeffrey Epstein. Many have, and as I've said in previous videos talking about Mind Unveiled, they also did a video about Epstein, Crowley, and the homunculus, and how Zorro Ranch, and where we know was a genetic cloning and genetic engineering and baby farming type of operation in New Mexico, not too far from White Sands and not too far from the nuclear test sites and all these things. And interesting how all these things connect. And so I'm going to try to get into that in the best way that I can. But let's start at the beginning, right? So now what we're calling the CIA, right, was there's a few people that were instrumental in the transition between the OSS, or Office of Strategic Services, which was the precursor to the CIA. So in the transition between the OSS and the CIA, there's a few people that were very critical to that transition. One of them being Ian Fleming, who is the author of all the James Bond novels and subsequent films, who was, MI5, MI6 operative for the British royalty, and of course his famous hero 007, going back to John Dee in the 1500s, who used 007 as his signature. And of course, tying back to our previous videos dealing with the Sabbateans, right, is against Sabbatai, the Shabbatais V, right? Many argue that him and his disciple Jakob Frank were instrumental, along with the Rothschild family, Epstein's famous patrons, right? All three of them were involved in the creation of the Bavarian Illuminati. And many people contend, and I think it's highly supported, is the idea that the OTO, which was Aleister Crowley's occult organization, Order of the Eastern Templars, Ordo Templi Orientis, right, was an offshoot of the Bavarian Illuminati. So pretty interesting. And of course, people, personally myself, and listening to Tim Refod and different people, I tend to believe that Crowley himself did take on the mantle of 007, right? He was a British and German double triple agent, probably with the OSS involved as well. Many people have speculated with quite a bit of a paper trail that he was involved in the start of World War I. He was active in World War II, spying on the Italian naval operations and in various intelligence operations. It's widely believed that he was the inspiration for the fictional villain in the first James Bond novel and film, Casino Royale. Le Chiffre character in that being based on Crowley. And I'm not going to go too far afield in that. It's a fascinating field of study, but let's just say this 007, right? And these Sabbatians, right? So what is that 007? Well, Shabbatai and the planet Saturn is associated with the number 7. And we think of the god Pan, right? Who Jack Parsons, as he was testing out and creating the foundation of modern rocketry, was doing ritual to Pan before all of his rocket launches. And of course, Pan being this goat god of sexuality and fertility and so on, which arguably is, very closely linked to these Sabbatians, right, who created the Illuminati. And the Rothschilds, of course, being highly implicated in bankrolling the Illuminati, as well as the, Napoleonic Wars, all the world wars, the creation of the CIA, creation of Jeffrey Epstein and his intelligence asset network. All these things are highly connected. And of course, basically, I would argue being the power behind the scenes, not only of the Vatican, but of the current so-called Windsor family, who is really the Saxe-Coburg-Goethas, who are basically, Germanic royalty. Of course, Prince Andrew, so-called King Charles III, right? Many people speculate that Princess Diana was actually not Diana Spencer, but actually Diana Goldsmith, and that she was closely blood relative of the Rothschilds. Many people speculate that Epstein himself is also a kind of bastard child of the Rothschild, as well as Bill Clinton, for instance. So this is, there's a lot there to look at. But now let's bring this back to the recent developments. Okay, we know this ongoing Epstein thing, and of course Wexner just got deposed. Ghislaine Maxwell recently had some testimony, and the issue of the Rothschilds keeps coming up, not for no reason, right? And arguably their organization, the so-called Bavarian Illuminati, was quite instrumental and was founded the same year, 1776, right? That the United States was created. That's not really coincidence. Of course, again, Rothschilds controlling the Vatican Bank. So, big power structure that's up until very recently been completely obscured and behind the scenes, and something that would be poo-pooed and dismissed by everybody in the mainstream. But now there's no real running away from that, and something really significant is going on with that. And of course, Wexner himself, arguably the complete kingpin at the much higher in pay grade than Epstein, and who gave Epstein his mansions and his plane and his lot of money, arguably was instrumental in him buying the famous island, or the famous 2 islands, Greater and Lesser St. James, right? So this guy was threatened by his lawyer that he would be quote unquote fucking killed, right, if he continued to go in too much depth about the Rothschilds' connection to Jeffrey Epstein. So if his lawyer can openly threaten him with death on that at the exact moment of implicating the Rothschilds in this whole thing, this is probably an important issue, okay? And so now let's come to our final piece of the equation, which is the recent proclamations by Donald Trump dealing with UAP disclosure, okay? Now this is going to come back directly into the Crowley OTO type organization, particularly Crowley and someone called Kenneth Grant, who was a close disciple of Crowley and who had a spinoff of the OTO called the Typhonian OTO. And both Crowley and Kenneth Grant went into great detail to describe this being called Lamb, who many people speculate as the origin of the caricature of the gray alien, right? So if you read the works of Kenneth Grant and Crowley, they talk about something very particular dealing with these grays, and how the grays, in essence, arguably could be seen as more or less a remote proxy for a non-corporeal intelligence manifesting in order to create influence in the material world through the vehicle of these so-called grays. And furthermore, Crowley and Kenneth Grant specifically refer to these grays appearing in conjunction with an egg-shaped craft, which is one of the things that's recently been disclosed by high-level military operators and various, people in the AARO, the All Domain Anomaly Resolution Office, as well as Anna Paulina Luna, and these various people in these government sort of groups talking about disclosure. We're specifically dealing with these egg-shaped craft and their retrieval, and these individuals, I'm not saying this is factually accurate, but I'm saying these individuals refer specifically to these egg-shaped craft as being the provenance of this so-called NHI's non-human intelligence. Meanwhile, we have Crowley going back to the 1940s and his disciple Kenneth Grant coming later talking about these egg-shaped craft and these grays, and specifically describing these meditations and visualizations, projecting the consciousness of this, of the adepts, shall we say, into not only the physical body of these grays, but also into this egg-shaped craft, in order to more or less be able to remote view or to spy on things in the material world through the proxy of these so-called grays and these so-called egg-shaped craft. So to me, this is all quite interesting. And if we look at the work of Crowley also, you could see why Epstein would be fascinated with Crowley and possibly trying to continue his research into cloning, and various types of genetic engineering and the so-called homunculus, right, which is the creation of a more or less humanoid artificial life form, right, to transfer the consciousness of a human or other types of entities into this homunculus, right, so that it becomes a controlled operator, much like what we think of as a clone or a biological created intelligence, right? And of course, like I said, we know Crowley's obsessed with sexuality and, transgenderism, homosexuality, this whole Mithraic deal, right? And this whole transgender obsession, which we know Epstein was funding a lot of transgender and gender transition research, right in line with this Mithraic view of Crowley, who referred to himself as the Baphomet, which he defined as Father Mithras, right? And how we know he was a homosexual and a cross-dresser, and that he instituted both hetero and homosexual rights as his initiatory grades within the OTO, okay? And in fact, this was what arguably got him into the OTO, was his publication of certain works where he was describing and writing through metaphor these homosexual acts of initiation, which was the reason why he was approached by Theodor Reuss, this German Bavarian Illuminatus, who was a high-ranking member of the OTO prior to Crowley joining, and read his writings on these sexual rituals, and use that as the sort of segue to approach Crowley and be like, hey, why are you giving away our secrets? And they, once they realized they had some common interests, and he chose to initiate Crowley into the OTO so that he would basically be sworn to secrecy rather than disclosing any of these matters in writing further beyond that, And so quite interesting. And of course, like I said, Crowley connected to the royal family, the MI6, and these initiatory orders, and by proxy, being involved with the Rothschilds and various machinations leading up to World War I and World War II, which the bankers were funding on both sides. And so now we see all these topics come full circle. We got the Rothschilds exposed. We got Epstein's sexual blackmail network exposed. We got the non-human intelligence so-called exposed. The CIA, again, being implicated in everything from the Kennedy assassination, concealing these space programs, if you will, the creation of NASA, the creation of the NSA, the creation of the modern state of Israel. All these things are coming around full circle. And again, all highly connected, all highly implicated. So the last piece of puzzle I want to bring in is this reptilian angle. Okay, so now this is something that's been gaining traction. Of course, the royal family being implicated with this reptilian concept, going all the way back to David Icke's publications in the 1990s. And so again, we see this upset. And, of course, reptiles have a bizarre relationship with gender and can be seen as gender transitioning themselves under various environmental conditions, right? And they are not sexually dimorphic in the same way as mammals. So we see this obsession with reptilian imagery, all this dragon imagery and serpent imagery going all through the initiatory orders of these different Masonic groups. And of course, the Rothschilds themselves being associated with so-called Leviathan. I think it was maybe Nathaniel Rothschild, I can't remember. One of these Rothschild scions referred to himself as the Leviathan of world finance. And in fact, the Rothschild wineries have a winery and a wine company called also Leviathan. And of course, Leviathan being this Hebrew word for the raised serpent. And of course, Leviathan being this aquatic sea monster, arguably one of the oldest creatures created by God on earth, living in the depths of the ocean. And of course, this figures again in Robert Anton Wilson's fictional works, so-called fictional works about the Illuminatus trilogy. So all these things seem to be quite connected and rapidly moving from the realm of science fiction slash fantasy slash conspiracy theory into, published fact, dealing with these bizarre conspiracies all intersecting in quite a remarkable way. And possible, genetic hybridization being connected with this, all Epstein's genetic research, with the transgender agenda, so-called, and with all this forms of sexual depravity to deconstruct and possibly hybridize between human beings and these more reptoid genetic patterns. So quite fascinating, quite fascinating how these worlds of, genetic research, blackmail, sexual deviancy, government agencies, non-human intelligences, all seem to be colliding in quite a public way. And again, like I say, these works of so-called fiction becoming disturbingly close to reality the more time progresses. And, the very foundations of our governmental structure, of a world economy, of all these intelligence agency networks rapidly coming to collide. And so just as all these things have been told over decades and have been considered fringe, woo-woo, non-scientific, well, that's open to question. And of course, now the spirit war is out in the open. And so I just want to make some commentary. Hopefully some of my followers will find this interesting, and everybody comment below and tell us what you think some interesting connections are to this research if you do find it interesting, and perhaps we can continue on with some more interesting details in the next video. I hope you've enjoyed Spirit War number 93, and we'll talk to you next time.